The second video on two-way feedback, and this time we are focusing on the information teachers can get about student learning. This can be the most powerful direction for feedback in a classroom, provided that we get the right information and that information is used to make good teaching decisions based upon student learning. The difficulty for this comes from the fact that there's an awful lot of information available to teachers in a classroom. So we need to be able to identify what's useful and what may be important at any point in a lesson. This is complicated by what the CEM identified called the poor proxies for learning. So these are things that are very easily observed but won't necessarily tell you about what the students are learning. So students being busy or engaged, or if the teacher is providing feedback or explanations to students, if the classroom seems ordered and well behaved, all do not necessarily tell you about what students are learning. Teachers having the feeling that they're getting through the content and therefore covering the curriculum, and the occasional hearing or seeing of the correct answer doesn't necessarily tell you about learning either. This is perhaps best summarised by Graham Nuttall, who said, "Learning is not encapsulated in the here and now of classroom activities. It is impossible for teachers to judge what their students are learning without much more detailed and individually differentiated data than they have available in the classroom. We simply haven't got the right information to make that judgment." So to start finding that information, planning is therefore essential. So the first thing would be to identify the concepts which are most important, to narrow the field down of the things that we are looking for. It could simply be just looking for the things you know students find difficult and therefore where you might need to provide more support if needed. Think about how you're going to get that information. Is it going to be through questioning, or is it going to be through assessment, marking work? And what tasks might give you the best information about student learning? The next two on my list here, numbers 4 and 5, are both about the same thing, about where in their learning sequence is the task or the students currently at. So what they're going to do next, what information do you need to tell you that it's okay to move on to that? If it's early in the teaching sequence, you would expect students to know a lot less than they would towards the end of it. So your expectations are part of this process too. To narrow down the field, think about what's important to your subject. Is there a big idea that's essential for all students to understand and know before you move on? Some ideas might lead to other ideas, so they might need some prioritization too. And if there's any misconceptions or any common mistakes, they might warrant a bit of extra focus from the teacher. But that's going to narrow down some of the information that's available within that classroom. We get our information basically through questioning of our students and from the tasks that they complete. But what we need to think about is how we get the best information from both of those. Now, teachers ask a lot of questions, and we only do it for two real reasons. One is to teach, and the other one is to gain information. But they're two very different pedagogical purposes, so they may actually be mutually exclusive. So when we're using questioning to teach, we're building ideas with students, we're reminding them of prior knowledge and building from that. And we use questions and prompts to guide students through thinking about the information we're telling them. These tend to be quite conversational, and they're certainly going to be non-judgmental from the teacher's point of view. However, when you're questioning to get information about what they know and understand, you might need to be listening for what is not said. So what are the gaps? You might need to be listening for what misconceptions the students hold. And if you're going to make a decision on this information to do something different in your classroom, you're going to need enough valid information to help you make that decision. The conversations here are very much diagnostic. So our teaching behaviours need to be different during each of those pedagogical uses of questioning. So if you're teaching, you're going to be giving clues and reminders, and that would include specific bits of information. So what about Y? What about X? Where if you're trying to get information, you don't want to be giving them any content information, but you might give them prompts like, Tell me more. Can you add anything extra? When you're teaching, you might want to give instant feedback and praise. Yes, that's spot on, well done. However, if you're trying to get information, you want to delay that confirming of the correct answer and providing praise, because you want to hear this from multiple sources, from multiple students, because that's the only way you're going to know where your whole class is at. However, if you're teaching, you might have a prolonged conversation with one student to help them think through publicly in front of the class to help other students follow that idea. When you're teaching, you might want to use hands up just to get that conversation going. However, when you're collecting information, you need to be quite systematic, and you want to find out from all corners of your classroom who understands and who does not. And this is where this idea of hinge questions might be a really useful way of collecting some of that information. Obviously, you can't ask every single student while questioning, so you might want to consider sampling. You just need enough information to get a reliable decision. So that's obviously going to depend on the concept. Some concepts, you might be 4 or 5 students have definitely got it. I'm happy with that. Or this is so important, I need to know that 100% of my students understand this before I move on. You can randomize that, who you pick, but you do know your students. So you might want to pick, a quiet student or a student who's very strong at maths in your subject, or as long as you're knowing what you know about students to find out about the whole community, you're going to get fairly reliable information. Hinge questions are a very simple technique. It's about designing a question, more than likely going to be a multiple choice one. I'm recommending 5 options just so it reduces the amount of guessing students can do. You definitely want to include a red herring or a misconception, because that's going to tell you a lot of information if that still exists. You want all students to respond, so perhaps using mini whiteboards or some kind of voting system. And then you definitely want to follow up with finding out why students think that, because that might reveal a little bit more about where the class is currently at. So here's a quick little example. Which of the following represents an object travelling at an increasing speed? So you can see I've identified an answer there. The potential misconception comes from the fact that students have to study velocity time graphs, and that's what it would look like. So the potential misconception is here would be the right answer if it was a velocity time graph, not a distance time graph. We can also get information from the work that students do, from student tasks. As I've said before, we do need to acknowledge when in the teaching sequence this happens. Students need multiple exposures to ideas in terms of getting that embedded in their long-term memory. I just need to remind you also that if the work's done, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's led to learning. And we talked about that in the previous video about the difference between performance and learning. So in a classroom, teachers spend a lot of time thinking about, is it okay to move them on to the next activity or task? And we tend to, focus in on task completion as a quick way of getting information. Who's finished? Oh, most of my class is finished. I need to move on. And it does give you something that you can kind of manage. We often describe this as reading the room. It does allow us to slow things down or speed things up. It may prompt you to re-explain an idea, or more than likely just re-explain the task. It's more like a task-focused feedback rather than a content-based feedback that we use in these situations. It may even, if the task isn't working at all, totally scrap that task and then respond with something totally different. Again, I just want to remind you that those poor proxies for learning might be things you're seeing in those student works. So, the work's finished, you're covering the curriculum, the work's done correctly, isn't necessarily telling you that the students are learning. So we need to think about the information that we are getting. So the information needs to come from a quality assessment. So can all students access the content knowledge in the question that you're asking or the task that you're asking? If students can deduce an answer, it may not be sufficiently well constructively aligned to tell you about student learning. So does the task allow deduction, or do the students simply need to know? The difficulty of the task that you set, so it's easier to recognise an answer than to recall it, but you know that in your subject some concepts are going to be more difficult than others. And if your assessment has one idea in, it's going to be more reliable than if it's got multiple ideas in. So students might get some ideas, but might get the one that you're particularly interested in too. Again, we need to think about this teaching sequence here. So when did you teach that idea originally? When have you assessed it? How many times have the students seen that information? And that's going to inform you on, is it okay to move on? If it's, I need another exposure to this idea for these students, then that is a decision you can base on a smaller amount of information. The type of task really makes a difference too, in terms of the quality of information that you get about student learning. So I've tried to identify these down as 3 simple different types of task. So one type of task would be to just build ideas up and let students, get a sense of what it's all about. And the next one would be to show that they do understand it. Bear in mind that could be performance. And then you've got task 2, actually assess the learning, what's been retained and what the students actually now know. This determines how we take that information and how we might respond to that. So during those construct tasks, the feedback that you're going to give as a teacher is mainly going to be task orientated. It's not going to be about the subject. So you probably end up re-explaining the task. You might have to manage the behaviour and the on-taskness, which is worth it if it's correctly, constructively aligned. There might be a little bit of content feedback, and you might ask a lot of leading questions, or you might emphasise details of things that you've previously discussed with the class. When you come to looking at tasks that demonstrate an understanding, remember, and this is the focus of this little presentation, is about getting information about student learning. So if students are struggling on this and you have to give help, you really do have to assume that the students do not get it. That's the information that you're getting back. All right. Just to complicate that, if you're looking at that information during a lesson, any issues in students' understanding might be due to the task design, or the teaching strategies used, or the form of assessment used. It mightn't be a lack of understanding about the concept, it's just how you're asking them to go about showing you that. So, part of our thinking in the back of our heads is we need to be asking ourselves, do students understand the concept? Can they follow the procedure of the task? Have I correctly, constructively aligned this? Or can the students means end think through this problem and get an answer that looks right without thinking about the concept? So we need to think about those things before we make a decision about reteaching or doing anything different. Again, when you're walking around the classroom, you wouldn't want to see every single student piece's work, but you would want to sample. I know that I would have a bias in my classroom that I would go and stand next to the students who are less likely to do the work, but then that means I miss some other students who have done it, but have done it incorrectly. So, when we're getting to that point of needing information, it's just making sure we're sampling around the classroom to get the information that's going to help us. You could, of course, delay that until the students have finished their work and then traditionally mark it. And again, you might be able to look at more student pieces of work here to see how the whole class is thinking about it, but it also might tell you more about the task rather than about student understanding. When we come to the final one, which should hopefully be truly about learning and what students have retained and understand, this definitely needs to be separated by time from the teaching. Students need a chance to forget things. So this is quite a useful thing to do, is that it allows you to revisit a concept, and that has the overall result of strengthening the recall too. Okay. Now, so when people think about testing kids, we instantly jump to this idea that we use an exam question, and these can be very useful. They're useful for practice and motivation, and they might be quite good for monitoring and just benchmarking against grade standards or something like that. But they have no value in being used to diagnose gaps in learning. And the reason for this is that most exam questions are only focused on a small part of a much bigger idea. The other complication thing that we have here is that they tend to be one-hit wonders. So, if a student in an exam gets a question right, then in the exam context, that's assumed that they know that wider domain of information. So the result of that, if you do an exam question and then go through it as feedback, basically the feedback you're going to be giving to students is simply going to be task level feedback, how to complete that particular exam question, and it doesn't necessarily address any misconceptions in that wider content knowledge domain. So if you're going to use exam questions, some of them will serve is that we need to have multiple questions addressing the same information. However, we know quite a lot of savvy test takers in our classrooms, and they'll simply take the information from one question and apply it to the next. So we need to think about how we can fairly cross-check that information, what students do and do not understand. So I just want to mention a couple of ways of collecting information about student learning. The first one is marking crib sheets. The first example here is quite a generic one. And if you look at this, you can see how this actually is monitoring some of those things that would be considered a poor proxy for learning. The real useful part of this comes from the misconception and common mistake section. This is saying, look, I've identified these things in your books and I'm going to do something about them. And that's the power of this feedback. These things can be differently sort of formatted. So this was taken from some exams that some students had done. So a list of what went well, and then the bit to revise, bring evidence that you have, and this is a list of things I wanted students to go off and respond to. Go and double check these facts and show me your notes. The things on the right hand side, the long-term practice things, are things that I as a teacher was going to do with that class. So if you looked at my student books, you would see this in their book, and then over the coming few weeks, you would see me addressing some of those things, practicing the weaknesses in those graphs. Students see that weakness, and then they can see that we're going to do something about them. Again, it just helps expose them to those ideas and get them focused practice on things that they had struggled to do in an exam. This is a much more specific focus. This was from one exam question. It was a 5-point A-level question on succession. And the question itself, the mark scheme itself, had 1 point for use of language. It didn't specify the language, which I've scribbled at the top: colonisation, pioneer, and climax community. And I really wanted to know that they were using the correct language in the correct way. So I just literally scratched myself a little grid, and you can see I went across there. The first student I looked at did it really, really well. The next one only used one of the words correctly, and then the next four hadn't actually attempted that question. They'd skipped that question. The next person got all of those words totally missing. So that tells me that when I say that class again, I'm going to start and I'm going to focus in on those words and how to use them correctly. It tells me to do something different. When we get information, there's 3 basic things that a teacher can do with their classes. They can simply move on and keep to the lesson plan. They can provide some feedback about the task or about the content before moving on, or they can provide more teaching. They could reteach those ideas. The other thing we can do with this information is we can evaluate what tasks have worked, what teaching strategies have worked for student learning. So when we're moving on, we can clearly just go as planned, we can modify the pace, we can insert a plenary or summary, and we could identify students that we would want to review with before they move on. Providing feedback, this could be about the content, it could be about the task, it could also be about developing metacognition. So how do you go about completing this style of exam question? How do you go about explaining this particular topic? It can take many forms. It could be hints and clues in the margins. It could be diagnostic questions to help them break the ideas down themselves. It could be providing a model answer to compare to their own. It could be verbal, written, peer or self-feedback. This is where we've been really focusing on, is how do we use that information to change our teaching? So it could be the information you get back is that you need to reteach that entire concept or that entire lesson. You might simply just need to review the main ideas and emphasize them. You might need to show them how to complete a particular task and use some teacher modeling. You might just need to go to one concept that they found very difficult. So it could be a 10-minute re-explanation of one simple idea. It could be that you need to give the students more practice with an idea, or another exposure, another way of thinking about that same information to make sure it's getting embedded. You might need to give them a simpler model if they've really struggled with a complex explanation, or they've only come up with showing you that they understand the basic ideas, and that you might need to go back through a more complicated version of that concept. And again, do you need to teach all the students here? Do you need to focus on 10 students and move the other ones on? The information available should really help you make that decision well. That's all for now. The next one will be on looking at how to provide great feedback to your students.